Hi everyone, I'm Any New Province, and this week we're going to find out if Take Vengeance is, possibly, Pauper, playable. Take Vengeance is a brand new and unique removal spell that was printed in Core Set 2019. Take Vengeance costs 1 and a white for a sorcery that destroys target tapped creature, which is a pretty high restriction compared to the other white removal we already have access to in things like Journey to Nowhere or Celestial Flare. Still, straight up destroying a creature just because it's tapped is a really powerful thing for a spell to do, so I wanted to build a deck that could maximize the potential of having a bunch of tapped creatures to target with Take Vengeance. That's why I've decided on this 75 called Dawnglare Tron. It takes a lot of inspiration from M. Lovebow's Ristic Tron, which they've just put up some new gameplay videos for. I'll put a link in the description down below. I want to start by going over a card that I've wanted to include in a mono white Tron list for a long time, but couldn't find the perfect payoff for doing so. This is Dawnglare Invoker, which not only ensures that our opponent's creatures will be tapped and targetable by Take Vengeance, but also has the ability to completely lock opponents out of combat steps. Dawnglare Invoker costs 2 and a white for a 2/1 flyer, which means it's also an evasive attacker that helps us end the game even if we can't activate its ability. Its activated ability is pay 8 generic mana, tap all creatures target player controls. I kind of wanted to go all in on the idea of removal spells that are restricted to targeting tapped creatures, so I've also included a copy of Sheer Drop to go along with our Take Vengeance and Dawnglare Invoker. Sheer Drop costs 2 and a white for a sorcery that destroys target tapped creature, but what makes it super interesting in a Tron build like this is that it has Awaken 3. Awaken says pay 5 and a white. If you cast this spell for that Awaken cost, also put 3 +1/+1 counters on target land you control. It becomes a 0/0 elemental creature with haste. It's still a land. Sheer Drop providing an extra body on board is really relevant for this deck, especially because having a lot of mana isn't really difficult for us to do. Once we're tapping all of our opponent's creatures, we want to end the game as quickly as possible with creature damage before our opponent finds a way out of our lock. Because Quirion Ranger exists, we need some way to turn the Dawnglare Invoker lock into a hard lock against green decks. That's why I've included 3 copies of Coalition Honor Guard in the main deck. Coalition Honor Guard costs 3 and a white for a 2/4 human flag bearer, and its ability says while choosing targets as part of casting a spell or activating an ability, your opponents must choose at least 1 flag bearer on the battlefield. Not only does this help hedge against things like Quirion Ranger, Coalition Honor Guard can also soak up our opponent's lightning bolts and disfigures that might be targeting our Dawnglare Invoker trying to get themselves out of our lock. Next, I'm going to talk about some of our less conditional removal. These are a couple cards that are really great at invalidating certain strategies, and I'd be an absolute maniac if they weren't included. First, we have Serrated Arrows, an artifact that costs 4 mana and enters the battlefield with 3 arrowhead counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, if there are no arrowhead counters on Serrated Arrows, you have to sacrifice it. Its ability is tap, remove an arrowhead counter from Serrated Arrows, put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. Unlike a lot of other Tron decks, we actually are running some low converted mana cost cards. Serrated Arrows is what we're going to use to kill our opponent's spell stutter sprites to sneak through things that cost 1 or 2 mana. Also, this completely invalidates the Tribe strategy if you can get it onto the battlefield, because after they cast Inside Out, Tribe will only have 1 toughness. Put an arrowhead counter on it, it's dead. We also have a couple copies of Prismatic Strands, which costs 2 and a white for an instant that prevents all damage that sources of the color of your choice would deal this turn. You can also flash it back by tapping an untapped white creature you control, which means you cast it out of your graveyard by paying that cost. You exile it afterwards. There are a ton of monocolored decks in Pauper, particularly the most aggressive ones. If they get off to a fast start, hopefully on turn 3 and turn 4, we can use Prismatic Strands to stop them from killing us while we dig to something like a Dawnglare Invoker or a Coalition Honor Guard to shut down their plan. These next few creatures not only provide a lot of evasive damage to close out the game, they're also a ton of value, which means if we run into some control opponents where a Dawnglare Invoker might not be that important, we still have a way to go over them. First, we have Muldrifter, one of my favorite commons. It costs 4 and a blue for a 2/2 flyer, and when it enters the battlefield, draw 2 cards. If that wasn't good enough on its own, you can also evoke it, which means you pay 2 and a blue, cast the creature, but when it enters the battlefield, you have to sacrifice it. You still get to draw the 2 cards though. We've also got a couple of copies of Custody Squire. Because this usually just acts as a glorified Gravedigger in our deck, I'm not including as many copies as M. Lovebow usually uses. Custody Squire costs 4 and a white for a 3/3 flyer with the Will of the Council ability, which means when it enters the battlefield starting with you, each player votes for an artifact, creature, or enchantment card in your graveyard. Return each card with the most votes or tied for the most votes to your hand. Custody Squire is going to buy back some of the less expensive spells that maybe were disrupted by our opponent in the early game, or buy back a Dawnglare Invoker or a Coalition Honor Guard to continue locking our opponents out of the game. Next, I'm going to go over the more traditional mono-white Tron package we have, starting with Core Skyfisher. Core Skyfisher costs 1 and a white for a 2/3 flyer, and when it enters the battlefield, you return a permanent you control to its owner's hand. This is usually a downside, but we've got a bunch of cards in our deck that turn this into strictly upside. One of those targets is Lone Missionary, our hedge against burn decks. Lone Missionary costs 1 and a white for a 2/1, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 4 life. Lone Missionary is a massive beating against burn, especially if you can buy it back a couple of times with Core Skyfishers or Custody Squires. Still, if we're in a slow matchup, Lone Missionary can attack for 2 starting on turn 2. That's a way we can sort of pivot into an aggro deck that ends the game early and prevents our opponent from getting too much value in the late game. Our other ideal Core Skyfisher target is Prophetic Prism. It costs 2 mana for an artifact, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. You can pay 1 and tap it to add 1 mana of any color. Prophetic Prism essentially makes our Core Skyfishers cost an extra 2 mana to cycle and replace themselves by drawing another card. It also hedges against the fact that we have a lot of colorless mana producing lands in our deck. This is going to make sure we have tons of white and blue mana to cast our colored spells. Finally, I'm going to talk about the package I've included to make sure we hit Tron on time. This deck is a little bit more reliant on it because you're trying to pay Dawnglare Invoker's activated ability, which costs 8 mana. Expedition Map costs 1 mana for an artifact that you can pay 2 and tap to sacrifice and search your library for a land card. Reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. This not only allows us to assemble Tron in a hurry, it also allows us to include a few Miser's copies of Singleton lands that deal with unique situations that some opponents might bring to the table. Finally, we have Impulse, my favorite way for a non-green deck to assemble Tron. Impulse costs 1 and a blue for an instant, and it says, look at the top 4 cards of your library, put 1 of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. I really love what Impulse does for this deck. It can dig us to a Tron land to make sure it's assembled when we need all of that extra mana, but it also allows us to play a few less copies of specific cards we'll be looking for to lock our opponent out of the game. Alright, let's have a look at this mana base, starting with the 12 Tron lands. The reason it's called Tron is because we're trying to assemble these lands like Voltron. Once we have 1 of each on the battlefield, they start producing a ton of mana. Once we have a copy of all 3 Tron lands on the battlefield, Urza's Mine starts producing 2 colorless mana, Urza's Power Plant starts producing 2 colorless mana, and Urza's Tower starts producing 3 colorless mana. I'm going to go over our specific tutor targets for Expedition Map next. First, we have Bojuka Bog. It enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, exile all cards from target player's graveyard. I'm super happy to be able to include a Bojuka Bog as a piece of main deck graveyard hate. We've also got 2 copies of Kabira Crossroads. I have 2 copies because it's not a big deal for us to play a couple of tap lands in the early game, and the little bit of life gain really helps us against aggressive and burn decks. Kabira Crossroads enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life. After it's become untapped, you can tap it to add white mana. Finally, we have 1 copy of Secluded Step, which enters the battlefield tapped. When it becomes untapped, you can tap it to add white mana, and it also has the ability to cycle, which means you can pay 1 white mana, discard Secluded Step if you don't need it, and draw a new card off of the top of your deck. Our last non-basics are 4 copies of Tranquil Cove, standard Pauper duels in blue and white. They enter the battlefield tapped. When they enter the battlefield, you gain a life, and when they're untapped, you can tap them to add blue or white. For our basics, we have 1 copy of Basic Plains and 1 copy of Basic Island, just 2 untapped sources of the 2 colors we may need to search up with Expedition Map if we draw that instead of the colored source we were looking for. Alright, let's have a look at this sideboard. First, we have a couple of copies of Circle of Protection Blue. We can easily be disrupted by a Skred Delver deck, so we may have to lock them out of the game with a Cop Blue instead of our Dawnglare Invoker. We have 3 Hydroblasts to shore up those red matchups because those decks get off the ground real quick. We have a copy of Seal of Removal for all of those combo decks to bounce a creature after our opponent goes all in on it, and maybe buy back the Seal of Removal with a Custody Squire. We have 2 Relic of Progenitus because we're a really slow deck, and this is going to help us control our opponent's graveyard so they don't get an early angler. We have another copy of Serrated Arrows just in case we're up against a deck with a lot of fairies or a Tireless Tribe. We have 2 Patrician Scorns for destroying all of our opponent's Journey to Nowheres or auras. We have a Coalition Honor Guard for another copy if our opponent is on a Lightning Bolt plan. They can only hit this with 1, it won't die. They have to hit it with another one to kill it. It's just really good against burn decks. We have 1 copy of Holy Light, which is great against X1 decks, and we have 2 copies of Oblivion Ring for dealing with all troublesome permanents. And there you have it, Dawnglare Tron. I'm going to take this deck into a league at twitch.tv/AnyNewProvince. We're there every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. Atlantic time playing possibly Pauper playable decks. Before I go, I just want to remind you that you can like the video or subscribe to the channel down below. I'd seriously appreciate it. It's a great way to let me know you've enjoyed everything, and it really really encourages me to keep making great Pauper content. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this deck tech, and hopefully I'll see you on Tuesday night.